I thought I had it all figured out. Life had been challenging, sure, but I had worked hard to build a life I could be proud of. My career was stable, my relationships seemed solid, and my dreams, though modest, were within reach. Or so I thought. But everything I knew about trust and loyalty came crashing down one ordinary evening. It started with a message. I wasn't the type to snoop, but lately, something had felt off about Emma, my wife. She'd been distant, her smile forced, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand. At first, I chalked it up to stress. She'd been working late at her job, and everyone knows how grueling the corporate world can be. But one night, as she drifted off to sleep, I noticed her phone buzz on the nightstand. A name popped up on the screen, Nathan, my brother. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Nathan and I hadn't been close in years, but maybe they were just chatting. After all, Emma had always encouraged me to patch things up with my family, despite the strained history. But the pit in my stomach told a different story. Against my better judgment, I picked up her phone and opened the conversation. What I saw made my blood run cold. The messages weren't friendly banter or casual family updates. They were intimate, riddled with inside jokes and plans to meet up when I wasn't around. As I scrolled further, the words became more explicit, the betrayal more undeniable. My wife and my estranged brother had been seeing each other behind my back for months. And the worst part? She was pregnant. A child I had been celebrating as my own was likely his. Couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I pieced together the moments that now felt like glaring red flags. Nathan's sudden visits to our house under the guise of reconnecting, Emma's insistence that I work late shifts to focus on my career, the way Nathan would linger a little too long when he greeted her, his hand brushing hers in ways I now recognized as deliberate. The next morning, I confronted her. My voice was shaking, my heart pounding as I laid out everything I'd found. At first, she denied it, her eyes wide with faux indignation. But when I mentioned the messages, her private confessions of love to my brother, her defenses crumbled. Emma sat in silence for a moment, then admitted it all. The affair, the deception, the baby that wasn't mine. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, tears streaming down her face. It just happened. Hurt me? She didn't want to hurt me? My entire life had been upended, my trust shattered, and all she could muster was a weak excuse for her betrayal. I packed a bag and left that day, unable to stay in the house that now felt tainted by lies. My marriage of 2 years was over, and the woman I had once loved became a stranger in an instant. But the betrayal didn't end there. My family, who had always treated me as the outcast, sided with Nathan and Emma. My parents, who had been distant since I was a teenager, defended their golden boy without a second thought. They told me to be the bigger person, to forgive and move on, as if my pain was an inconvenience to their lives. The more I tried to distance myself from the mess, the more entangled I became. My divorce turned into a battlefield, with Emma walking away with a generous settlement and my car, thanks to my family backing her fabricated claims about me being controlling and toxic. Meanwhile, Nathan basked in their approval, flaunting their support like a badge of honor. I was left with nothing but the house, an empty shell that now felt more like a prison than a home. I threw myself into work, determined to rebuild my life from scratch. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw the scars they'd left, emotional wounds that refused to heal. But slowly, I found solace in my own resilience. Promotions came, my salary grew, and the life I once thought was lost began to take shape again. Then, just as I thought I could finally leave the past behind, my mother called. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since the divorce was finalized. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as she asked me to visit. When I refused, she grew desperate, showing up at my office unannounced, causing a scene that left my coworkers whispering for days. She claimed the family needed my help, that Nathan had lost his job, and the household was struggling to make ends meet. I couldn't believe the audacity. After years of neglect and betrayal, they were coming to me, the family scapegoat, for a bailout? I ignored her at first, but her persistence was relentless. Eventually, I agreed to visit, if only to put an end to her harassment. When I arrived at their house, it was clear things weren't as idyllic as they'd once pretended. The grand facade of family unity was cracking under the weight of financial strain. Nathan was unemployed, Emma was out of work, and the settlement money was dwindling fast. My parents looked at me with pleading eyes, hoping I'd swoop in like some savior to rescue them from their self-inflicted mess. As they explained their situation, I felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. They had spent years dismissing me, ridiculing my choices, and now they had the gall to ask for my help. I let them speak, their words blurring into a cacophony of excuses and justifications. When they finished, I stood up, said nothing, and walked out the door. The rain was pouring as I stepped outside, but I didn't care. My mind was racing, my emotions boiling over. Just as I reached my car, Nathan appeared. His smug face twisted into something resembling desperation. He begged me to reconsider, to think about the baby and the family I was supposedly abandoning. His words hit like daggers, but I refused to let him see my pain. "You made your choices," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Now live with them." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of Nathan standing there, drenched in the rain, shouting after me like a man desperate to rewrite the mess he'd created. It should have felt satisfying, but instead, there was a heaviness in my chest. Not guilt, no, they didn't deserve that from me, but the weight of years of unresolved hurt, of being the outsider in a family that should have protected me. For the next few days, my mother's calls came in waves, each one more frantic than the last. When I didn't respond, she resorted to texting, her messages swinging wildly between guilt, tripping me about, abandoning my family, and begging me to reconsider. I ignored them all, focusing instead on my work and the new life I was building. I thought they'd eventually give up, but I was wrong. Nathan showed up at my house uninvited one evening, his face a mask of indignation. He acted as though I had wronged him, as though I were the villain in this twisted narrative. He accused me of being bitter and jealous, of punishing the family for what he claimed was my inability to measure up. "You think you're better than me just because you've got a promotion and a nice house now?" he spat, his voice rising. "You're still the same pathetic loser you were when we were kids. And you know what? Mom and Dad were right to favor me. I've always been better than you." His words were venomous, each one laced with the kind of arrogance only someone who had never faced real consequences could muster. But I didn't let him see how deeply they cut. Instead, I smiled, a calm, deliberate gesture that seemed to unsettle him. "If you're so much better than me," I said, my tone ice-cold, "why are you standing on my doorstep, begging for my help?" His face turned red with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might hit me. But before he could say anything, I stepped back inside and shut the door. I stood there for a while, leaning against it as his muffled shouts faded into the night. It wasn't until I heard his car peel out of the driveway that I finally exhaled. The next morning, I received a call from Emma. I almost didn't pick up, but a part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost hesitant, as though she were trying to gauge how much power she still held over me. "I know you hate me," she began, "and I don't blame you. But the baby—" "Stop," I interrupted, my patience already wearing thin. "Don't you dare use that child as a bargaining chip." She fell silent for a moment, then let out a shaky breath. "We're drowning here," she admitted. "Nathan can't find work, your parents can barely afford their bills, and I don't know what to do. I know I don't deserve your help, but they're your family too. Don't punish them for what I did." Her words were calculated, designed to tug at the remnants of loyalty I still felt toward my parents. But I wasn't the naive man she had once manipulated so easily. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. She wasn't calling out of love or regret. She was calling because she needed something from me. "I already gave you more than you deserved," I said, my voice steady. "You took everything from me. My trust, my dignity, my money, and now you want more? No, Emma, you don't get to do this. Not anymore." Before she could respond, I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was anger. Anger at the audacity of these people who had torn me apart and still thought they had a claim on my life. The final straw came a few days later when I returned home from work to find my parents, Nathan, and Emma waiting on my doorstep. They didn't even look embarrassed. My father, always the self-appointed patriarch, stepped forward as though he had the right to be there. "We need to talk," he said, his tone more a command than a request. "No, we don't," I replied, my voice firm. "Leave, or I'm calling the police." My mother looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, the kind she used when I was a child and she wanted me to do something I didn't want to. "Please, Alex," she said softly. "We're your family." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the quiet street. "Family? You stopped being my family the moment you chose him over me. You've spent my entire life tearing me down, and now you want me to save you? Why? Because you're out of options?" Nathan stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You're being a selfish prick," he snarled. "You're only doing this to get back at me, and you know it." "Maybe I am," I shot back, meeting his glare. "And maybe you deserve it." He lunged at me, his hand grabbing the front of my shirt. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me, but my father pulled him back, shouting at him to calm down. The scene was almost comical. My once proud brother, now a pathetic shell of himself, being scolded like a child. "Get off my property," I said, my voice low but firm. "This is your last warning." They hesitated, my mother trying one last time to appeal to my non-existent sense of guilt. But I didn't budge. Finally, they left, their retreating figures a pitiful reminder of the family I had lost long ago. As their car disappeared down the street, I stood there in the fading light, a strange sense of peace washing over me. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from their expectations, their manipulation, their toxic love. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I was done letting them control me. The silence after they left was almost unsettling, but it didn't take long for that peace to settle into something deeper, something more permanent. For years, I had been shackled by their expectations, their disdain, their complete disregard for my worth. And now, for the first time, I was free of it. Or at least, I was learning to be. The following week was blissfully quiet. No calls, no unannounced visits, no drama. I threw myself into work, focusing on the promotion I had earned and the responsibilities that came with it. It felt good to pour my energy into something productive, something that reminded me of my value. But of course, the quiet couldn't last forever. It started with an email. Not from Emma or Nathan, but from a mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The subject line was simple. "You should know this." Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a screenshot of a social media post, a long-winded diatribe written by Emma. She had painted me as the villain, claiming I had abandoned my struggling family and refused to take responsibility for the child I once claimed to love. It was manipulative, self-serving, and designed to elicit sympathy from anyone gullible enough to believe her. At first, I wanted to ignore it. Let her dig her own grave, I thought. But the comments, dozens of them, all from people who didn't know the truth, started to gnaw at me. Strangers calling me heartless, selfish, even abusive. And worse, some of my former friends had joined in, offering their condolences to Emma and condemning me in the process. It was infuriating, but more than that, it was humiliating. I knew I couldn't let it slide. Not this time. So, I did something I hadn't done during the divorce. I fought back. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. Messages, photos, even testimonies from people who had witnessed Emma and Nathan's betrayal firsthand. I reached out to old friends who had distanced themselves after the divorce, filling them in on the truth. To my surprise, many of them were willing to stand by me, admitting they had been misled by Emma's lies. When I finally had everything I needed, I posted my own statement. It wasn't a rant or a revenge piece. It was a calm, measured account of the truth. I included screenshots of Emma's messages with Nathan, the evidence of their affair, and even a video from a family gathering where my parents had openly belittled me while praising Nathan. It wasn't about shaming them. It was about reclaiming my narrative. The response was immediate. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, apologizing for believing Emma's lies. Strangers who had initially condemned me began to backtrack, their comments shifting from judgment to sympathy. And Emma? She deleted her post within hours, but the damage to her carefully curated image was already done. For the first time, I felt like I had taken control of my life. No longer the victim, no longer the scapegoat. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And while I knew there would always be scars, I also knew I was stronger because of them. But, of course, Emma and Nathan weren't done. A few days later, I received a letter, official-looking, delivered by courier. It was from Emma's lawyer, demanding additional alimony on the grounds that my recent promotion constituted a significant change in circumstances. The audacity was almost laughable. I immediately called my lawyer, a trusted friend who had been with me through the divorce. When I explained the situation, he laughed outright. "Let them try," he said. "We've got more than enough to counter anything they throw at you." Over the next few weeks, we built an airtight case. We gathered more evidence, including testimonies from people who had seen Emma's manipulations firsthand. My lawyer even managed to get statements from a few of her former friends who had distanced themselves after witnessing her true nature. By the time we went to court, we were more than prepared. The hearing was tense, but ultimately, it was a victory. Not only did the judge deny Emma's request for additional alimony, but they also ruled to terminate the existing arrangement entirely. For the first time in over a year, I was free of her financial hold. The look on her face as the verdict was delivered was one I would never forget. Shock, disbelief, and, for the first time, a glimmer of regret. Nathan, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, stormed out before the hearing even ended. My parents didn't bother to show up, likely too ashamed or too prideful to face me. As I left the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. I had fought back and I had won. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at a restaurant I hadn't visited in years. A small, cozy place with the best steak in town. As I sat there, savoring the meal and reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something important. For years, I had defined myself by the way my family treated me, by their rejection and betrayal. But now, I was finally learning to define myself on my own terms. It wasn't about revenge or proving them wrong. It was about finding peace, about building a life that was mine and mine alone. And for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. A week passed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel like my life was truly my own. No calls from Emma, no surprise visits from Nathan, and certainly no desperate pleas from my parents. The court's decision had solidified my independence, both financially and emotionally, and I was determined to keep it that way. But peace doesn't always last when you've got people like them in your life. It was late on a Friday night when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and given everything that had happened recently, my first thought was that it had to be Nathan or Emma trying to stir up more trouble. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my father standing there, looking older than I remembered. His posture was slouched, his face drawn with exhaustion. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of concern, but it was quickly replaced by a wall of caution. I opened the door just enough to make it clear I wasn't inviting him inside. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone as cold as the autumn air outside. He hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. "I just wanted to talk," he said finally. "Just you and me." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk about what? How your golden boy is doing. Or maybe how you and Mom have been surviving without my money." His face tightened, but he didn't snap back like I expected. Instead, he sighed heavily. "Look, I know we've done a lot of things wrong, more than I care to admit. But your mother's not well, Alex. She's been having a hard time since everything fell apart." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "So you're here because Mom's upset? Not because you need something?" He shook his head. "No, it's not about money. I swear. I don't want to leave things like this between us. Not after everything. For a moment I almost believed him. But then I remembered every manipulation. Every time they had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. I had spent my entire life chasing their approval, only to be met with indifference or outright disdain. Forgiveness wasn't something I was ready to offer. Not yet. I think you've said all you need to, I replied, stepping back to close the door. Wait, he said quickly, his voice breaking slightly. Please, Alex, just think about it. If not for me, then for your mother. I didn't respond. I simply shut the door and locked it, leaning against it as I tried to calm the storm of emotions his visit had stirred up. Part of me wanted to believe that he was genuine, that maybe this was his way of trying to mend things. But another part, the part that remembered years of neglect and betrayal, knew better. The following morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from my father, written in his usual neat handwriting. I debated throwing it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, he had written a long, rambling apology, peppered with excuses and justifications for why they had treated me the way they did. He talked about how hard it had been for them to manage with Nathan and Emma's struggles, how they had made mistakes out of desperation, and how they hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive them. The letter ended with a plea, "You're still our son, Alex. We want you to be part of this family again. Please, don't shut us out." I stared at the letter for a long time, feeling an odd mixture of anger and sadness. They wanted me to be part of the family now, after everything? After siding with Emma and Nathan during the divorce, after years of belittling me and favoring my brother, now they wanted to play happy family? It was almost laughable. But instead of letting it consume me, I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer. I wasn't ready to deal with it. Not yet. For now, I had my own life to focus on, my own happiness to build. They had made their choices, and I was making mine. As the weeks went by, I started to rebuild my social life, reconnecting with old friends who had distanced themselves during the chaos of my marriage and divorce. It felt good to have people in my corner again, people who saw me for who I was rather than the version of me Emma had tried to paint. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. One evening, as I sat in my living room, scrolling through emails, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Julia, an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd heard about everything that had happened and wanted to reach out, offering her support and a friendly ear if I ever needed to talk. We started catching up, exchanging stories about our lives and reminiscing about the old days. Julia had always been someone I admired. Kind, intelligent, and unapologetically honest. Our conversations became a regular part of my routine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope for the future. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was sitting across from her at a small cafe in the city, that I realized just how much I had missed this. Real connections, real conversations. Julia didn't pity me or try to fix me. She simply listened, offering her perspective when I needed it and laughter when I didn't. As we said our goodbyes that evening, she smiled and said something that stuck with me long after she'd left. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Alex. Don't let anyone make you forget that." For the first time in years, I believed it. The weeks that followed were a blur of progress and introspection. My life was finally moving forward, piece by piece, and while I wasn't completely free of the shadows of my past, they no longer felt as heavy. Julia's encouragement had sparked something in me, and I found myself looking at the future with cautious optimism. But as life seemed to settle into a new rhythm, the past found its way back, as it always seemed to. This time, it came in the form of another uninvited visitor, Nathan. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my backyard, working on some long-overdue landscaping, when I heard the gate creak open. I turned, half expecting a delivery person or a neighbor, but there he was, standing with his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Do you ever knock?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He shrugged, stepping closer. "Didn't think I needed an invitation." "You do?" I replied flatly, setting down my gardening tools. "What do you want, Nathan?" He hesitated, his gaze darting around the yard before finally settling on me. I wanted to talk. I raised an eyebrow. We've had plenty of talks, and none of them ended well. So unless this is an apology, you're wasting your time. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know I've screwed up. Okay? I know I've been selfish. But things are bad, Alex. Worse than you think. I crossed my arms, waiting for him to continue. Emma left, he admitted after a long pause. Took the kid and moved back in with her parents. Said she couldn't deal with the stress anymore. I wasn't surprised. Emma had never been one to stick around when things got tough. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for him. As much as I resented Nathan, I knew what it was like to feel abandoned by someone you thought you could trust. And what do you expect me to do about it? I asked. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. I don't know, man. I'm drowning here. I lost my job, my family's falling apart, and Mom and Dad, he stopped himself, shaking his head. They're not doing great either. I just thought, maybe you could help. I laughed bitterly, unable to hide my disbelief. Help? You want me to help you? After everything you've done? I know I don't deserve it, he said quickly. But you're the only one who can. You're the only one who has their life together. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man standing before me with the brother I had grown up with. The brother who had been handed everything on a silver platter while I was left to fend for myself. For years I had envied him, hated him even, for the way our parents had doted on him, for the opportunities he'd been given that I never had. And now, here he was, stripped of his arrogance, his life in shambles, asking me for the help he'd never once offered me. It was tempting to throw his words back in his face, to revel in his misery as he had once reveled in mine. But as I looked at him, I realized something. I didn't need to. His life was his punishment. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. I can't help you, Nathan, I said finally. Not because I don't want to, but because you need to figure this out on your own. If I step in now, you'll never learn. His face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he'd known all along what my answer would be. I'm sorry, Alex, he said quietly, for everything. I know I can't take it back, but I needed you to know that, for a moment, I didn't know what to say. The apology I had wanted for so long, the acknowledgement of his wrongs. It was finally here. And yet, it felt hollow, like a band-aid on a wound too deep to heal with words alone. Take care of yourself, Nathan, I said, turning back to my tools. That's the best thing you can do. He stood there for a moment longer before nodding and walking away. As the gate clicked shut behind him, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the resolution I had imagined, but it was enough. The following week, I received another message from Julia, inviting me to join her and a few friends for a hiking trip. It wasn't something I would have usually agreed to, but something about the idea felt right. A chance to step out of my comfort zone and embrace the new life I was building. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. The fresh air, the stunning views, and the company of people who genuinely cared about me. It was a reminder of how far I had come. As we reached the summit and looked out over the sprawling landscape below, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. This was what life was supposed to feel like. Free, full of possibility, unburdened by the weight of the past. When we returned to the base of the trail, Julia pulled me aside, a mischievous smile on her face. You survived, she teased. I was half expecting you to turn back halfway through. I laughed, shaking my head. I almost did, but I'm glad I didn't. She nodded, her expression softening. I'm glad too. You deserve this, Alex. A fresh start. As I looked at her, I realized she was right. My past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. I was more than the betrayals, more than the hurt and the anger. I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, and for the first time in a long time I felt ready to move forward. In the days after the hiking trip, I found myself reflecting on everything Julia had said. A fresh start. It sounded so simple, yet it carried so much weight. For years, I had been tethered to the pain of my past, letting it shape the way I saw myself and the world around me. But now, for the first time, I felt like I had the power to redefine my life. Work continued to go well. The promotion had not only come with better pay and perks but also with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. I threw myself into my projects, earning respect from my colleagues and even forming new friendships along the way. It was a far cry from the lonely, hollow days after my divorce, and I cherished every moment of it. But, as always, the peace was short-lived. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave the office, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Urgent, Family Matters." My first instinct was to delete it, assuming it was just another attempt by Nathan or my parents to pull me back into their chaos. But something made me pause. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was from my mother. "Alex, I know you don't want to hear from us, but I need you to know that things have gotten worse. Your father's health is failing, and we're struggling to keep up with the medical bills. Nathan is doing his best, but he's barely holding it together. I know we've made mistakes, so many mistakes, but we're still your family. Please, Alex, we need you." I stared at the screen, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and frustration. It wasn't the first time they had tried to guilt me into helping them, but this felt different. The mention of my father's health struck a chord, even though I wished it didn't. Despite everything, he was still my dad. I closed the email without responding. I needed time to think. That weekend, I confided in Julia about the message. We had been growing closer since the hiking trip, and her perspective had become something I valued deeply. "What are you going to do?" she asked after I explained the situation. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me feels like I should help, but the other part, I just don't know if I can trust them. They've lied so many times before." She nodded thoughtfully. "It's a tough spot to be in. But whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with. Don't let them manipulate you into something that goes against your gut." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation. I spent the next few days mulling over the email, trying to separate my emotions from the facts. Finally, I decided to get some answers. If my father's health was truly as bad as my mother claimed, I needed to know for sure. I called the hospital listed in her email and asked to speak with his doctor. After some back and forth and a bit of convincing, I managed to confirm that my father had indeed been admitted for complications related to his heart. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to warrant concern. Armed with this information, I decided to pay them a visit, not because I felt obligated but because I needed closure. I needed to see for myself whether their cries for help were genuine or just another ploy. When I arrived at their house, it was clear that things had taken a turn for the worse. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, the paint on the shutters peeling. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. My mother greeted me at the door, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Alex," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." I stepped inside, my gaze sweeping over the living room. It was cluttered and chaotic, a stark contrast to the meticulously kept home I remembered from my childhood. My father was sitting in his recliner, looking thinner and more frail than I had ever seen him. Nathan was nowhere to be found. My mother led me to the couch and sat down across from me. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "I know we've hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I don't expect you to forgive us. But I'm begging you, Alex. We need your help." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I glanced at my father, who looked away, his expression one of shame or maybe guilt. Couldn't tell. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind them of all the ways they had failed me, all the times they had chosen Nathan over me. But another part of me, one that I wasn't ready to confront, felt a pang of compassion. "What do you need?" I asked finally, my voice devoid of emotion. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Just a little help with the bills," she said quickly. "We don't expect you to take on everything, but anything you can spare would mean the world to us." I nodded slowly, considering her words. "And Nathan?" I asked. "What's he doing to help?" Her expression faltered, and she looked away. He's trying, but he's struggling. You know how hard it's been for him. I clenched my jaw, biting back the bitter retort that threatened to spill out. Of course, Nathan was struggling. He had spent his entire life relying on everyone else to clean up his messes. But I wasn't going to be his safety net. Not this time. I'll think about it, I said finally, standing up. But don't expect much. My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Alex. That's all we can ask. As I left the house, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, pity, and a strange sense of relief. I had faced them on my terms, and for once, I hadn't let their guilt trips control me. Whether or not I chose to help them, the decision would be mine. And that, more than anything, felt like a victory. The drive home felt heavier than usual, like the air in the car was weighed down by years of unresolved emotions. The house I just left was a symbol of everything I'd been trying to escape. Old wounds, broken trust, and the constant reminder that I had never truly belonged there. And yet, there I was, entertaining the idea of helping the very people who had caused me so much pain. It felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked for, but part of me wondered if it was the right thing to do. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's tear-streaked face, my father's frail frame, the worn-down house that had once been immaculate. The memories clung to me, refusing to let go. Julia noticed something was off almost immediately. We were out for coffee when she asked, her tone gentle but firm. "What's going on, Alex? You've been distant lately." I sighed, stirring my drink absent-mindedly. "It's my parents. They're struggling and they've asked for my help. I don't know what to do." She leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What kind of help are they asking for?" "Money, mostly," I admitted. "Medical bills, living expenses. They're in a tough spot, and I get that. But I can't shake the feeling that it's more about guilt than need." Julia nodded, taking a moment to choose her words. "It's okay to feel conflicted. You have every right to protect yourself after everything they've put you through. But if helping them won't harm you, financially or emotionally, it might give you some peace. Not for them, but for you." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. She was right, this wasn't about them. It was about me, about finding closure on my own terms. But the question remained, could I help them without reopening old wounds? That weekend, I sat down and reviewed my finances. Thanks to my promotion and careful budgeting, I had enough to offer a small amount of help without it affecting my own goals. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it felt like the right balance between compassion and self-preservation. I decided to transfer a modest sum directly to the hospital to cover part of my father's medical bills. I didn't tell them about it. I didn't want to hear their thanks or deal with their attempts to use it as a way to reel me back in. It was a gesture, nothing more. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my mother, her handwriting shaky but familiar. "Alex, thank you for helping your father. I know we don't deserve it, and I know it doesn't erase the past, but I want you to know how much it means to us. I hope someday we can find a way to fix what's been broken. But until then, please know that we're grateful." I folded the letter and put it in the same drawer as the others. It didn't bring me the sense of satisfaction I thought it might, but it didn't hurt either. It was just neutral. And maybe that was progress. As the weeks turned into months, the contact from my family grew less frequent. Whether it was because they had found another source of support or had finally accepted my boundaries, I didn't know. But for the first time, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. Julia continued to be a constant in my life, her presence a source of light in what had often felt like a dark and lonely journey. We spent more time together, our conversations growing deeper, our connection stronger. She never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give, and for that I was endlessly grateful. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me and said, "You've come a long way, Alex. I hope you see that." I smiled, the kind that came from a place of genuine contentment. "I think I'm starting to." She reached for my hand, her touch warm and steady. You deserve happiness. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. In that moment, I realized something important. Happiness wasn't something that came from the approval of others. It wasn't something that could be taken away by betrayal or loss. It was something I had to build for myself, piece by piece, day by day. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the right track. As time passed, life began to settle into something that resembled normalcy. My days were filled with work, my evenings often spent with Julia or catching up on hobbies I'd long neglected. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me, free from the shadows of my past. But, as much as I wanted to move forward completely, remnants of that past still lingered, waiting to resurface. One evening, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. At first, I considered ignoring it, assuming it was spam or a wrong number. But something told me to read it, and when I did, my stomach sank. Alex, it's Nathan. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. It's important. I stared at the screen, a mix of frustration and curiosity brewing inside me. What could he possibly want now? Against my better judgment, I replied, keeping it brief. What do you need? His response came quickly. I'm in trouble. I need your help. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, but another part, the part that still remembered the bond we'd once shared as kids, felt compelled to at least hear him out. After some deliberation, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the other side of town. When I arrived, Nathan was already there, looking worse for wear. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, and there was a nervous energy about him that made me uneasy. He glanced up as I approached, offering a weak smile. Thanks for coming, he said, his voice subdued. Make it quick, I replied, taking a seat across from him. What's going on? He hesitated, fidgeting with his hands. I screwed up, Alex. Again. I borrowed some money from the wrong people, and now they're coming after me. I don't know what to do. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. And you think I'm going to bail you out? After everything you've done? He winced at the harshness in my tone but didn't argue. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm desperate. They've threatened to hurt me if I don't pay them back. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was classic Nathan. Making reckless decisions and expecting someone else to clean up the mess. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. As much as I wanted to walk away, the thought of him getting hurt was hard to ignore. How much do you owe? I asked finally, my voice cold. He hesitated before mumbling a number that made my eyes widen. It was more than I had expected, but not entirely surprising, given his history of poor decisions. I can't give you that kind of money, I said firmly. Even if I wanted to, it's not my responsibility to fix this for you. He looked down, his shoulders slumping. I don't know what else to do, he said quietly. They'll kill me, Alex. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Have you talked to the police? He shook his head. I can't. If I go to the cops, they'll come after the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Nathan's recklessness had put not just himself but potentially all of us at risk. My initial reaction was to walk away, to leave him to deal with the consequences of his actions. But something in his voice, fear, desperation, made me pause. Fine, I said finally. I'll help you figure this out, but don't mistake this for forgiveness. I'm doing this because I don't want anyone getting hurt. Not because I owe you anything. His eyes widened in relief. Thank you, Alex. I swear, I'll make it right. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but for now it didn't matter. I was determined to get through this mess without letting him drag me down with him. Over the next few days, I worked with Nathan to come up with a plan. I refused to pay off the debt directly, knowing it would only enable him to make the same mistakes again. Instead, I helped him negotiate with the people he owed, using every bit of leverage and strategy one could muster. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I thought the whole thing would fall apart, but eventually we managed to reach an agreement. When it was over, Nathan looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," I replied. "Just don't put yourself or anyone else in this position again." He nodded, his face serious. "I won't. Promise." Whether or not he would keep that promise, I couldn't say. But as I walked away from that chapter, I felt a sense of closure. I had done what I could, and now it was up to him to take responsibility for his life. Back at home, I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring out the window at the city lights. The weight I'd been carrying for so long felt lighter somehow, as if finally standing up for myself had allowed me to let go of some of the pain. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally in control of my own life. Julia called later that evening, her voice a welcome balm to my weary mind. We talked for hours, her laughter reminding me that there was still so much good in the world, so much to look forward to. And as I hung up the phone, I realized something important. I was ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever the future held. Life moved on, slowly but surely. After everything that had happened, I found myself appreciating the quiet moments more than ever. My mornings were spent enjoying the simple pleasures of coffee and sunlight streaming through my windows, while my evenings often ended with long conversations with Julia or a good book. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. Nathan's crisis had been a wake-up call. Not for him, but for me. Helping him navigate the mess he'd created had reminded me of the boundaries I needed to maintain. I couldn't save him or my parents or anyone else who refused to take responsibility for their actions. All I could do was choose to live my life on my terms, free of their chaos. Julia continued to be a steady presence in my life, her warmth and humor a constant source of comfort. We weren't rushing into anything serious, but the connection we shared was undeniable. She had a way of seeing through my walls, of reminding me who I was beneath the layers of hurt and anger. And slowly, I was starting to believe in myself again. One evening, as we sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Have you ever thought about what's next for you?" she asked. I smiled, sipping my drink. "You mean besides surviving one day at a time?" She laughed, nudging my shoulder. "No, I mean your dreams, your goals. What do you want for yourself?" The question caught me off guard. For so long, my life had been defined by survival. Getting through the divorce, rebuilding my career, setting boundaries with my family. I hadn't stopped to think about what I truly wanted beyond all of that. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I think I want to keep building something meaningful. A life that feels authentic. Maybe even start a new chapter, whatever that looks like." Julia nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've already come so far, Alex. Whatever you choose, I know you'll make it great." Her faith in me was humbling, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement for the future. There was so much I didn't know, so much uncertainty, but instead of fearing it, I was ready to embrace it. The next few months were a whirlwind of growth and discovery. I took on new challenges at work, deepened my friendships, and even started volunteering at a local community center. A small but meaningful way to give back. Each step felt like a reclaiming of myself, a reminder that I was capable of more than I'd ever given myself credit for. Nathan reached out once or twice, each time with updates about how he was trying to get his life back on track. I listened, offered polite encouragement, but kept my distance. I wasn't angry with him anymore, but I knew better than to let him too close. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it certainly didn't mean reopening old wounds. My parents, on the other hand, stayed quiet. Whether it was out of shame or simply resignation, I couldn't say. The silence was bittersweet, a reminder of the family I'd always wanted but never truly had. But as much as it hurt, I had made my peace with it. I didn't need their approval to feel whole. One day, as I was leaving the community center, I spotted a group of kids playing basketball in the courtyard. Their laughter was infectious, their joy palpable. Watching them, I realized something profound. I had spent so much of my life looking back, on what I'd lost, on the ways I'd been hurt, that I'd forgotten to look forward. But now I had a chance to do things differently, to focus on the good, to create a life that was full of laughter and light, just like those kids on the court. That evening, I sat down at my desk and made a list. It wasn't anything grand or overly ambitious, just small goals, things that brought me joy and fulfillment. Travel to a new city, learn how to cook something from scratch, spend more time outdoors. The list grew, each item a reminder that the future was full of possibility. Julia called later that night, her voice as bright as ever. "How was your day?" she asked. "It was good," I replied, smiling. "Really good." As we talked, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a quiet confidence that I hadn't felt in years. My life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, and that was enough. The past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, and I had come out stronger on the other side. And now, as I looked ahead, I realized that the best was yet to come. For the first time in a long time, I was free.